Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to see you're still awake after that wonderful lunch, not too soporific. My favorite quote is this quote from Einstein, that the formulation of the problem is often more essential than the solution. In my experience in education, we have an affliction I call answer-itis. We frequently have answers to questions that have not been adequately explored, solutions to problems that a lot of people don't yet understand. So what I want to do today is explore with you a different way of understanding the crisis in American and indeed in global education. I call it the between a rock and a hard place. It's a very uncomfortable place to be. The rock. In a very, very short period of time, we have transitioned from an economy where most people earn their living with these to an economy where if you expect to get anything more than a minimum wage job, you must have a skilled one of these. The skills for a successful career, the skills for continuous learning, and I would argue the skills for active and informed citizenship have converged. They're the same skills. And we neither know how to teach or assess those skills. That's only half the problem. The hard place is that this generation is very differently motivated to learn, as we'll come to understand. So the question becomes, how do you motivate this generation to want to achieve excellence defined at an even higher level? Which to me suggests the need to reframe the educational problem. It's not about reform. Some more testing here, a little more professional development there is not going to get us a solution to those two problems. We have to rethink, reimagine, reconceptualize education, teaching and learning for the 21st century. So let me go into a little more detail here about each half of this sort of equation that I believe we need to solve. 3 years ago, at the insistence of my wife, I read The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. How many of you have read that book? Glad to see so many of you have. Very influential book. But it became clear to me in a way that I hadn't understood before that any job that can be turned into a routine, white collar, blue collar, service, doesn't matter, is being either offshored or automated. And so I began to worry about what kinds of skills will our young people need to get and keep a decent job in this new global knowledge economy. And are they the same skills they'll need to be continuous learners and to be active and informed citizens? So I decided I'd do some research. I decided I'd start interviewing senior execs. I'd start looking at all of the workforce readiness reports that were then coming out at a rapid clip to try to better understand what are these skills and in what ways are they different from the kinds of things we've been emphasizing in schools in the past. And I came to understand that there are, in fact, 7 survival skills which every young person will need to get and keep a good job, to be a successful learner, and an active and informed citizen in the globe, as well as in our democracy. So let me briefly describe what these are and how I came to learn about them. By the way, my understanding is that this PowerPoint presentation will be available to you on the Asia Society's website, so no need to cramp your hand with all kinds of note-taking. Here briefly are the 7 survival skills as I came to understand them. Critical thinking and problem solving. Why is that important? Because it's very clear that every organization that is competing internationally, the ones that compete the most successfully, engage all of their workers, their employees, in a process of continuous improvement of their product, their process, or their service. It was from Toyota that I learned something about the Toyota production system, where in fact, when you work on an assembly line in Toyota building cars in a team, you have 3 jobs. Contrast this with GM, by the way. Number 1, your job is to build cars, but to build them in such a way that you take responsibility for quality so that any employee can stop that assembly line at Toyota if there's a problem. Number 2, you're engaged in conversations about how to build higher quality cars with fewer defects. Number 3, you're engaged in conversations about the cars of the future and what they need to become, so that every employee is using his or her mind to think critically and to solve problems. And that's the way Toyota explicitly expects all of their employees to be engaged. Second skill is collaboration across networks and leading by influence. I came to understand from the folks at IBM that teamwork doesn't happen so much in a room anymore as it happens across the country and even more across the globe. When IBM sets out to solve a problem or to create new knowledge, they find the best talent from around the world to work together on a team that is primarily self-managed. Now, to work successfully on that team, you need a couple of things. First of all, you need to understand and respect differences. Apropos of the mission of this society, differences that are cultural, religious, racial, ethnic. These differences, I mean, these teams that these companies put together across countries are extraordinarily diverse. But secondly, you need to lead by influence. The command and control structure that has characterized so many businesses and other endeavors in recent years has collapsed, so that the person who is most effective as a leader is not leading from positional authority anymore. They're leading rather from their ability to engage others and to ask the right questions. Third is agility and adaptability. Even if you stay in the same job, in the same company, which is not common these days, that job is changing continuously. It was Clay Parker, CEO of a multinational company called BOC Edwards, who said they had restructured every single year for the last 3 years. And in each time, every employee is having to learn new skills. I saw recently, just in the last few weeks, interviews with the CEO of Microsoft and also Xerox, talking about how in this new economy, being agile and adaptable and being able to work across departments and across issues is increasingly important in this new economy. Initiative and entrepreneurialism. It was Mark Chandler, who's vice president and general counsel at Cisco, who said that if he has an employee who sets 5 goals and meets all goals, that's no longer good enough. He said, on the other hand, if he has an employee who sets 10 stretch goals and perhaps only succeeds with 8, he or she is a hero. All of these large companies are deeply concerned about how to keep the entrepreneurial spirit alive, how to create an environment that promotes and encourages entrepreneurialism and initiative. Effective oral and written communication, the number one complaint of both employers and college teachers alike is that young people coming out of both high school and college cannot communicate effectively. It was a senior exec at Dell who said to me, you know, first and foremost, the problem with their writing is with their thinking. They can't analyze. They can't reason. Their writing is fuzzy because their thinking is fuzzy. He said that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem, and this were his words, they don't know how to write with voice. They're so used to sort of churning out sort of papers by rote, by formula, that they can't write persuasively. They can't clearly articulate a point of view, which is extremely important in those kinds of settings. 6, accessing and analyzing information. I mean, it goes without saying. We all know this from our experience here, that the amount of information that is available to us is increasing exponentially here as we sit at this luncheon. And so the ability not only to do an effective web search, but more importantly, to understand what is the important information, what is the really critical information from what is trivial or what won't be important tomorrow is an absolutely indispensable skill. The last is curiosity and imagination. It fascinated me. How many of you have read A Whole New Mind by Daniel Pink? Not as many. That's another book I would really encourage you to read, because he makes the case that in a commoditized economy, where every product begins to look the same, it is those products that have some imaginative or more playful element, think of the iPod or the new iPhone, that is going to capture people's imagination. And so to be a good designer, to have creative skills becomes increasingly important in the marketplace. We got that? But if it's for me, I'm busy, okay? So, but I've been thinking about this in another way recently. Did you know that 72% of the American economy has been based on consumer spending, and it's gone up every year? And people have afforded their consuming habit by going into debt, as you know. The savings rate in 2007 was minus 2%. People were literally spending money that they did not have to buy things they often do not need, destroying the planet in the process. So what I've been worrying about, in fact, what I'm going to be writing this next book on, is the question of what's going to be the engine of the American economy in the 21st century if it's not based on compulsive consumption. And I think it has to be based on innovation, and not just in science, technology, and engineering. It has to be that we become the country that produces more better ideas for how to improve things or do things in entirely new ways, beginning with how to create a sustainable planet. So it seems to me the question becomes then, how do you educate for innovation? Leading me to kind of my day job. My day job, and has been for a number of years, is to work with educators who are aspiring to become more effective change leaders. Their schools, their districts, their foundations, their nonprofits. And so I spend a lot of time, almost every week, in classrooms working with educational leaders. I was I don't go often to private schools, but I was in one recently where the CEO in a small meeting turned to everybody, then looked hard at me and said, you know, why is it the longer our children are in our school, which is a K-12 school, the less curious they become? So let me tell you some stories about things I've been seeing in classrooms and in districts all over this country, in some of our better classrooms and districts. I'm in a district about a year ago that was a semifinalist for the Broad Prize, which is a prestigious award. It's a district that has made adequate yearly progress with every single school, every single year, nationally recognized, very diverse district. And so they decided to do a strategic planning process and to engage the community in a conversation about what do they want their graduates to know and be able to do? What's really important in today's world? And no surprise, they come up with a list very similar to this. First and foremost, critical thinking and problem solving. Secondly, students who can take responsibility for their own learning. So the next day I'm with the superintendent and his cabinet, and as a precondition for working with a district, I ask that we do a learning walk together. Note, I don't call it a walkthrough, which teachers hear as drive-by. No, we call it a learning walk. Very important distinction, right? So it's a learning walk, which means that we're there to learn about how to look at and talk about instruction. And so we agreed that we're going to look for evidence of these two qualities. The previous evening, 400 people in the Civic Center had just said were the most important qualities that this district should be ensuring students master. So we go to a hand-picked middle school, and we go to a hand-picked high school, where the principals in each of those two schools have hand-picked their 6 best teachers for us to go observe. Some setup, huh? So we got the whole team going, and we take notes in each class on these two qualities, critical thinking, problem solving, and evidence of independent learning. And then we sit down in the afternoon, and we spend as much time debriefing each class as we actually spent doing our learning walks. Very important to do. So we go around the room with each class. Evidence, critical thinking, problem solving? No, no. Evidence that students were actively engaged in independent learning? No, no. I'm watching the superintendent, who's kind of shaking his head. Finally, he looks up and he says, you know, the problem isn't that these are bad teachers. They're some of our best. The problem is us. They're doing exactly what we've asked them to do, which is teach to the test. A few months later, I'm working with the folks from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We're looking at some of their early college, high schools. Grantees have been working for several years to create a kind of seamless transition from high school to community college. And we're interested in to what extent these 3 schools that are in their system are really preparing students for college-level work. So in a period of 2 days, we go to 3 schools. We visit 6 classrooms in each of 3 schools. Sit down to debrief. We agree in only 1 out of the 18 classrooms did we have reasonable confidence, based on the evidence we saw, that students were being prepared for college. Let me give an example of one that wasn't making that particular cut. It was an advanced placement chemistry class. It was a lab which meant that the recipe for the lab was on the board. Sometimes I wonder what's the difference between that and a home ec class, you know? You get a recipe, you start cooking, right? So these kids are cooking on their Bunsen burners according to the recipe. And I'm watching this one group because there's smoke curling out of their beaker, and it's not supposed to be. So I'm just dying to know how are they going to problem solve this one, right? So I'm watching, and they're just standing there like this. The teacher's over at his desk grading papers. They're waiting for the teacher to come over and fix it. So, you know, being the recovering high school English teacher that I am, I had to go over and talk to them. So I went over. I said, got a problem? Uh-huh. The experiment didn't work? Uh-uh. Do you know why? Uh-uh. I said, finally, what's your hypothesis about what might have gone wrong? They look at each other. I said, do you know what a hypothesis is? And one said, that was a vocab question last month. Isn't that like an idea of something that's supposed to happen? These students did not have the first understanding of the scientific method. A few months later, I'm talking to Jonathan King, who's one of the leading molecular biologist researchers in the world. He's at MIT, and he trains people to do this work. But he also, by choice, teaches a freshman lab course. And his first assignment is to have students look in the microscope and describe what they see. And he said, you know, they can't do it. He said, these kids have taken 4, 5, 6 advanced placement courses. They've all scored 5s. And they look in the microscope and they get all anxious and they get nervous. And a hand goes up and a kid says, what should I be looking for? And Dr. King says, just describe what you see. And he said, they want to know what the right answer is. They can't do research. And he said, you know, it's not just the AP kids and it's not just the high school. He said, you know, my 2 sons both went to good public school, had completely different experiences. And he proceeds to tell me, his oldest son in 4th grade was taken on a field trip. They gathered water samples at the pond, brought it back, looked at it in a microscope, and his son came home so excited because he was doing science. 3 years later, second son, same school, same teacher, 4th grade teacher, no field trip. Dr. King makes an appointment to go talk to him. What happened? And she says, you know, Dr. King, there is nothing I would rather do than take these kids out. I know how important that is, but I can't do that. You see, we have to prepare them for the test now. We don't have time. Folks, I have to tell you that I think whether it's AYP or AP, there is increasingly only one curriculum in America's schools and in others around the world that I've observed as well, and that's test prep. Now, if the tests are good tests, as they are in other countries, like the PISA test, like the College and Work Readiness Assessment that I know a few schools here are using. If they're a good test, then I think that's just fine. I don't have a problem with that. I believe in accountability. But the problem is we're trying to do accountability on the cheap in this country. We're using computer-scored multiple choice tests that tell us absolutely nothing about whether a student can reason, analyze, hypothesize, weigh evidence, read text well, and really comprehend what they're reading. Nor does it tell us anything at all about how well students can communicate, the things that matter most. So what I see, in fact, is a global achievement gap. And that's the gap between what even our best schools are teaching and testing versus the skills that all young people will need to get and keep a good job. But there's also something called the global learning gap, which I didn't talk about directly with that phrase in the book, but let me describe it to you. Matt Kulik, whom I met at MIT as a student in his 3rd year, and he went to an advanced placement academy for his last 2 years of high school. All he did was take AP courses, 12 or 14, I think. I said, what was that like, Matt? He said, you know, I learned how to take tests. I said, well, what about science? He said, you know, I was passionate to become a scientist. And he said, I feel burnt out now. First, all of those courses, and then my first year of courses here at MIT, I feel completely burnt out because we're not doing science, we're doing memorization for the tests. He dropped out for a year, has come back, he's changed his major. Matt doesn't want to be a scientist anymore. You know what he wants to do? He wants to teach. He says, you know, there's got to be a better way. And what I came to understand is that this generation, the other half of the problem, the rock and the hard place, is in fact very differently motivated. They're a lot more like Matt than you might think. This is a generation that first and foremost is growing up tethered to the internet. For them, a bad day is having a slow internet connection. It's just, you know, and the idea of a dial-up connection, well, that exists with dinosaurs in a dark and scary past. They can't imagine that. But you know, what's interesting is, I mean, sure, there's all kinds of issues about partial attention span and so on, and I understand that. But we need to understand what they're doing on the internet, because it's different than how many of us use the internet. First and foremost, they're using it to extend friendships that are based on real interests. They're doing self-directed, much more exploratory learning. And they're using the internet as a tool for self-expression. They're uploading their own video, their own blogs, their own photographs, and so on, in a stunning degree. So outside of school, this is a generation that is constantly connected, collaborative, creating, multitasking. Inside of school, sit and get. I don't see behavior problems in schools, urban, suburban, rural. I go there all the time. What I see is kids barely there, 5% of their brains engaged, doing school, as a colleague of mine says it. They also have a very different attitude towards authority, in case you haven't noticed. You know, they have less fear and respect of adult authority, in part because they're learning more from colleagues, from friends. But, you know, at the same time, they really crave coaching and mentoring, but only from adults who refuse to talk down to them or talk at them. It's not that they want the adults to necessarily be friends, but they want to engage them on a more mutual basis. Finally, as we learned from Matt, this is a generation that really wants and needs to make a difference. This is a generation that is very intolerant of, you know, ditto sheets and make work, and they're not going to put up with it, either in school or in the workplace. I mean, they may do it to get by, to get along, but they're not going to do it with their heart and soul. They're not going to do it in a way that really actively engages them. So, bringing these two things together, let me just talk a little bit about what I think the implications might be for you and your work. And then I want to take some questions and hear your comments, because I'm here to learn from you and answer questions you may have. I think there are three cornerstones to this new work that we need to be about. First and foremost, we need to hold ourselves accountable for what matters most. Now, I'm going to tell you some horrible stories. Everybody, you know, knows whether or not they've made AYP. Very, very few teachers or administrators or district leaders whom I've met can tell you their real high school graduation rate. They know what they report to the state, but do you know that that's a lie in most cases? Because the state permits it. Every state writes its own formula for how you report your graduation rate. So I'm in a district, I'm going to name it. I was in the state of Florida last year. I'm in a district that has a 90% graduation rate according to its website, just got an award from the state. It's the night before I'm supposed to do a presentation. I get on the web, I look at what Education Week reports, which has a clear and consistent and accurate formula for reporting graduation rate. Their graduation rate was 68%, not 90%. Over and over again, we see this. North Carolina just redid their formula, and their graduation rate dropped 22% from what had been reported the previous year to what had been reported this year. So the issue is, first and foremost, yes, you have to attend to AYP. I understand that. But the more important criteria is attainment. Are you graduating 100% of your kids? That's question one. How many of you know that? Then the next question is, how many are going on to some form of post-secondary, which is increasingly a minimum requirement for an entry-level job in this economy? Do you know that? You can find out. You can have your high school join the National Student Clearinghouse, which reports out that data on 91% of the colleges and universities. You can know exactly by student whether or not they've persevered, whether or not, first of all, they matriculated, they actually went to college as opposed to self-reporting, and then secondly, whether they got a degree and how long it took them. You can use something called the College and Work Readiness Assessment, which you can Google when we're done, or now in the back if you'd like, and which is a test of 4 skills: analytic reasoning, critical thinking, problem solving, and writing, to find out exactly how your kids are doing. You don't have to give it to every kid. You give it to a demographic sample. It's a way of doing an audit. This district I mentioned, as I'd begun work with them, did an audit like that, and they came to find out that their top 50% of their seniors, and they'd already lost 25% of their kids. So the top 50% of the kids remaining scored in the lowest quartile of college freshman students on those 4 skills: analytic reasoning, critical thinking, and so on. So what I'm talking about is a different level of accountability, a higher level of accountability for what matters most. Do you think AYP matters to kids? Zippo zero, not at all, nothing. But does it matter to kids, to their lives, to their futures, that they graduate from high school, that they graduate career, college, and citizenship ready, that they persevere in college? Absolutely. So we have to hold ourselves accountable to that standard. And we can't just rely on the data. I urge you to consider doing focus groups with current students and recent graduates and videotape them. Because when you ask your recent graduates in what ways were you most and least well prepared, and they start talking, they're going to say things you may not be ready to hear. But more important than you're summarizing what you just heard for your faculty, you take that tape back and you play it for your faculty. And you say, what did we hear? Now what are we going to do? The second piece of this is doing the new work in new ways. Quite simply, education is arguably the most isolated profession in modern work life. And isolation is the enemy of improvement. I went to Andreas Schlescher's breakout this morning, and it was very, very clear that the countries that have the highest scores on PISA also have the highest rates of teacher collaboration, beginning, of course, with Finland. And that's no accident. It's through the collaboration that we create kind of peer-based accountability, that we create reciprocal, relational accountability, that we learn from each other, that we problem solve together. So the issue here is doing the new work, doing it in new ways, by teaching and testing the skills that matter most, and working in a very, very different way. So let me conclude, because I really want to hear your questions and comments. The issue here is accountability for children's futures and being very, very clear about what they need for career, college, and citizenship readiness. The issue is ensuring that we're teaching the skills that matter most. Content is important. Let me repeat that, because everybody misunderstands me. Do I want kids to know that the Civil War happened before World War I? Absolutely. Do I want them to know that when the Russians invaded Georgia last summer, South Carolina wasn't going to be next? Of course I do. Do I want them to speak a second language? Absolutely. Absolutamente que sí. Those things matter, but they're not enough. We need to use content to teach core competencies. And so each one of us in our own teaching and in our own schools has to be very, very clear when we do a unit of study, not just this is what we're going to cover, but these are the competencies we're going to develop, and this is how we're going to assess them. Now, the exciting thing is that I see teachers, and I'm in schools that are doing this new work, that are reinventing American public education every single day. Often against the grain, sometimes all alone. I call them random acts of excellence. So there are folks doing this work, and so you can join a sort of growing network that declares ourselves accountable